Welcome to Layer the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, a first in my new series of what I'm calling What If. This is where I take a moment to ponder some important events in music history and wonder what would have happened if things had turned out differently. So the first topic that I've picked for today is what if Roger Waters had not left Pink Floyd? Now, I think when Roger left, he thought that the band that was it, that the band couldn't possibly carry on without him. And to his surprise, David Gilmour and Nick Mason and Richard Wright came back and put the band back together and had a pretty successful run. And I think it makes you wonder that if Roger had stayed with the band, where would the band have gone? And I think with this question, it's not too hard to imagine because we have Pink Floyd continued on with the other three guys and Roger went and did his solo career. Now, I would say that Pink Floyd was way more commercially successful than Roger was with his solo career. And I may do a video at some point kind of doing an overview and my thoughts of Roger's solo albums. But there's no denying that Pink Floyd was more successful, that Roger struggled to regain any of the fame and fortune that he had when he was in Pink Floyd. I think the lesson that he learned is that the band name especially, is bigger than any one individual. If you take your average person who only listens to your local classic rock radio station and you ask them who's the band that does Another Brick in the Wall or Wish You Were Here, they'll quickly tell you, oh, that's Pink Floyd, Money and Time and all that stuff. But if you ask them who the bass player in Pink Floyd was, the average person that just listens to classic rock radio probably wouldn't know. They probably wouldn't know who any of the members of the band are, and that's kind of understandable because, again, the band name is always bigger than the individual members, and I think Roger learned that the hard way. Now, with that said, I think that even though Pink Floyd without Roger Waters was still very commercially successful, they transitioned pretty well into the MTV era. If you remember, like Learning to Fly, for instance, that got a ton of video play. It was still, for me at least, missing something. And this is a good example of the sum coming together to really form something. Without Roger's sort of acidic and dour look on the world, and Roger's sort of overall conceptual concepts, I think that was really missing from those Pink Floyd albums without him. And the same holds true with Roger's solo stuff. Without David Gilmour providing the more melodic, more uplifting feel to some of the music, Roger's solo stuff just often feels way too sort of unfocused, way too sour, and we sort of got a glimpse of this with The Final Cut. The Final Cut was the last Pink Floyd album with Roger in the band, although really at that point, a lot of people consider that almost Roger's first solo album. I did an in defense of The Final Cut really early on in my channel because I do really like that album. But it's obvious that when you don't have David Gilmour adding his elements of sort of melody and the more uplifting things, when it's just all Roger, it can really get weighed down. And an example of this in Roger's solo career is The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, his first proper solo album. And although I kind of like that record, it's a little unfocused. It's lacking sort of the melodies and maybe a little bit more different dynamics to it. Another great example of this in play for me, I always say the song Comfortably Numb is a perfect example. you've got the verse part, hello, is there anybody? And that part, which is really Roger, you know, it feels that's sort of Roger, the minor key part, the moody part of the song, and then the uplifting part, there is no pain, you are, where that's David Gilmour. You know, it has that uplifting feel, that melodic feel, David's voice, in contrast to Roger's. I always thought David was a much stronger singer than Roger was. And not that I don't like Roger's voice, but Roger's voice across an entire album is a little bit too much. So where would the band have gone? Well, I think that if we want to look for clues, again, we can look at, I don't think the band would have had the success that they had with like The Wall or Animals or certainly Dark Side of the Moon. Like most bands at that point in their career, if we want to make a comparison maybe to the Rolling Stones, okay? The Rolling Stones had their big era in the 70s and maybe the early to mid 80s, and then they fall into this pattern, which I think Pink Floyd would have done also. Maybe releasing an album every 5 to 7 years, which is pretty much what Pink Floyd was doing with A Momentary Lapse of Reason. That came out 7 years after, I think, the final cut. And then A Delicate Sound of, or The Division Bell came out like 5 years after that. And the same thing kind of with Roger. Roger was doing a solo album roughly every 5 years. So I don't think they would have put out anything like The Wall again. But I also, let's say they had come to some sort of peace, some sort of mutual agreement to try to work together. I also don't think they would have gone down the path of the final cut. That was unsustainable. Richard Wright was basically out of the band. David Gilmour had very little contributions on that record. So I think what we would have gotten would have been something like A Momentary Lapse of Reason, where you have a few songs that maybe get some radio airplay, that get on MTV, but we also would have had some of the moodier and darker pieces from Roger. Maybe it would have been pulled together a little bit better around a concept, because I think that the one thing that Roger did bring to the band was giving the albums sort of a focus and an idea. You think about Animals, you think about The Wall, The Final Cut, even Wish You Were Here. These were albums that all sort of had they had a feel or a mood to them, or a theme that's sort of not really concept albums, but themes that went across them. Dark Side of the Moon is another example. So I think that, you know, The Final Cut came out in '83. So let's say they would have put out an album somewhere in the late '80s, maybe. I could see them, with Roger in the band, I couldn't really see them turning into a greatest hits thing where they were just touring every other year playing greatest hits. But then again, I mean, that's kind of what Roger does now, is he just goes out and he plays mostly Pink Floyd things. I mean, I saw him his last tour and he played a couple songs, like two or three songs from his new record, and the rest was just all classic Pink Floyd stuff. So I think that, you know, the band probably would have been like the Rolling Stones, for instance. Every 4 or 5 years, they would have put out a record. They would have gone on a huge, massive tour for like a year, year and a half that would have taken them all over the world. And I think the albums would have been good albums. I think they would have been better than anything Pink Floyd put out and that Roger put out, although I do like The Division Bell. I like, for instance, Amused to Death from Rogers. But I think if you put those things together, whenever I hear Pink Floyd without Roger Waters, I think, man, if only Roger was here, he could have added some of the elements that this is missing. And the same thing with Roger's solo stuff. If only David Gilmour was here, it could have, you know, added so much more. I mean, the pros and cons of Hitchhiking, Roger had Eric Clapton in there on guitar, and to me that was an attempt to try to fill that void from David Gilmour, but he was still missing Dave's voice and Dave's songwriting. So what if I think the band would have fallen into sort of like a legacy band thing, every 5 to 7 years put out an album. they wouldn't have released anything as successful as they did before, but I still think they would have been interesting records. Not great albums, but probably albums that the hardcore fans would have enjoyed, looked forward to them coming out and debating where the album ranks in their catalog and everything like that. So, all right, so there you go. What if Roger Waters had stayed in Pink Floyd? And let me know down in the comments below what you guys think. What would have happened to Pink Floyd? Where would they have gone? What would have been their career trajectory if Roger had stayed with the band? All right, let me know down in the comments. And until we see you again, make sure you rock hard, ride free.